What is up, guys? Welcome back to Overspray. In today's video, we got some mechanical work we need to do. In today's video, we are working on a 2000 Toyota Solara, and this customer actually brought this car in to me after taking it to several different shops trying to get a quote for a laundry list of repairs. And well, she really just wanted to do the bare minimum, and I told her the bare minimum would be front and rear brakes because they are making scraping noises. And well, this car actually sits for a long time, so I did notice that the rotors were, well, kind of rusty as well and making a lot of scraping noises. Now, the thickness of the pads in the front were, well, I would say somewhere around 50%, and the rear probably around 40%. I also went ahead and pulled some codes because I did notice a check engine light, and as you guys can see, I have multiple cylinders misfiring and a system to lean, including knock sensor codes as well. And well, when I popped the hood, well, I noticed why the car would actually have a system to lean code because, well, we have an intake boot that is torn, sucking in a lot of air. Also went ahead and checked the spark plugs, and well, it does need a tune-up, but of course this customer is within a budget, so we're going to try to work within that budget for her. Christmas is around the corner, and well, they're kind of tight on money, so I have to work with this customer, try to get them a good deal. I already went ahead and gave them a price of how much it's going to cost to fix, and well, fortunately it's within their budget. I guess this is going to be a Christmas gift to their son. So yeah, we're gonna go ahead and fix it for her. We just got here to my local O'Reilly auto parts store. Let's go get some parts. We are back from O'Reilly's, and I went ahead and grabbed some degreaser. Also went ahead and grabbed a Dorman air intake hose. And of course we have the rotors and the pads as well. So let's go ahead and get started with the work. So we're gonna go ahead and get started by disassembling the front brakes, including the caliper bracket, the pads, and then also removing the rotor, and go ahead and replace them. As you guys can see, it was quite rusty there. Went ahead and cleaned off all the oil on these new rotors. Of course, because there is some machining oil, you want to remove that first before installing them on your vehicle. Now, I also went ahead and checked the pins and lubricated them with Sil Glide, and I also lubricate the pads as well, just to make sure that we got a really good lubricated brake system and there's no binding of those pads as they squeeze that rotor. Now, later on, I do find another issue with the car, and well, I did tell her the problem with the car is also she needs a master cylinder and booster, which was, well, pretty vital to the brake system, right? Because, well, this car is not going to stop with a bad master cylinder and booster. Unfortunately, when I did tell her, she was like, you know what, just do the front brakes and the intake boot, and that's all I want to get done. But I really had to try to convince her that she really needed a master cylinder and booster because, well, without those vital components, this car is not going to appropriately stop. So later on, I do end up doing the booster and master cylinder after some, well, convincing. So now that we got the front brakes done, it's time to lower the vehicle, and I always try to use jack stands, of course, just for added safety. Now I'm gonna go ahead and also torque the wheels. I try to torque the wheels as much as possible, only because sometimes these cordless tools don't really tighten as tight as you would want them to, so it's always a good measure to double check the torque. Now we're gonna go ahead and move on to the intake boot. Now you guys could see there is a massive split in the intake boot. This was actually causing a lean condition because it's sucking in air that is unmeasured from the mass airflow sensor. As you guys can see, the mass airflow sensor is in the front, the leak is right after the mass airflow sensor, and well, it's not measuring that extra air that is coming into the vehicle. So we're gonna go ahead and use this Dorman part. Now, I don't usually like to recommend Dorman parts, but in this case, it's just an intake boot. How bad could it really be? So I just went ahead and grabbed a Dorman. Now, I was actually very lucky that O'Reilly's even had it in stock. Now, when I took the original intake boot off, you guys could see that, well, it's very, very oily and dirty. So I'm gonna grab some Tubble Towels, which is a company that sponsored one of my TikToks. And well, they sent me some free product, and I gotta say, I'm really satisfied, genuinely satisfied with the product. So I went ahead and used it to clean the throttle body, and I'm gonna go ahead and reinstall the new part back into the vehicle. So once I got the car started, I noticed immediately that the car was running much, much better now that we replaced the intake boot and of course added some fresh oil. Now, I did mention that this car also needed a booster and master cylinder, but at the time the customer just didn't want to do the repairs. And I told them, you know what, this is a vital part of the brake system. You need to get this done. And of course, they're working within a budget of about 300 bucks. So I told them for 300 bucks, I could do the intake boot and the front brakes. But I really strongly recommend the booster and master cylinder. And well, after some convincing, I was able to get them to actually give me the okay to do a booster and master cylinder as well. Here is a really quick clip of how I can tell that it needs a booster. Not sure if you guys can hear, but we're actually looking at the brake pedal right here, and I'm not sure if you guys can actually hear it, that sucking noise. Now watch what happens when I press the pedal. You can see you got a different change in that vacuum noise. So this booster is definitely done. Yeah. Yep, you can hear it. Definitely leaking. So of course, after the customer okayed the work, I went ahead and ran back to O'Reilly's, grabbed our master cylinder and booster, and got to work. Now the booster is the same throughout the models, but there is a difference between the master cylinder. This one happens to be a 15/16, so just make sure you have the right part. Now, of course, they might be in decimal form, so this one is a 0.94, whereas the other one would be 1.0. Now I'm gonna go ahead and remove the crossbar here just by removing these two bolts here, and then go ahead and use my impact to remove them. Of course, doing the same thing on the other side as well, just to give us enough room to actually pull out the booster. I went ahead and also disassembled part of the intake boot as well, and give us more working room to remove that master cylinder. Now, sometimes these hoses can be quite hard, especially these old rubber parts. So what I like to do is just grab my little mini torch and heat up that rubber. Now you could also use a heat gun, but at this case, well, I just felt like the torch was much easier. Now you do have to be careful because there are some lines that you can melt. Of course, there's a lot of plastic parts in this area. There might be some fuel lines. So just be cautious when doing anything like this, especially with an open flame, okay? So more of words of the wise, just make sure that there's no fuel leaks. Now I'm gonna go ahead and use a line wrench here to break loose the brake lines on the master cylinder. You always wanna use the brake line wrenches anytime you're loosening them up, of course, because you don't want to round off these lines. They are very important, and well, sometimes these lines are very long, and you don't want to have to remake one of these lines. Trust me, I've been there. It sucks. Just use the right tool from the get-go. Now, as you guys can see how corroded that booster is inside, that is because it has been attacked by brake fluid. The brake fluid is very corrosive, and very acidic, and it attacks any metal surfaces, and you can see all that rust in there. So the next portion that we're gonna do is go ahead and remove a spring, also a pin, and 4 mounting bolts for that booster. So as you guys see me working here, it is kind of a tight area. This is under the steering wheel, of course, right next to the brake pedal. And well, you guys can see it's not the best view, of course, but I tried the best I could with the camera angles there. So after removing everything in the brake pedal area, went ahead and pulled the booster. Now the booster, like I said, very, very easy to do really once you get everything kind of out of the way and disassembled. Now you guys can see the kind of the white residue on the booster. That's because the master cylinder has been leaking, and even there is a warning label saying make sure you don't you replace the master cylinder, because if you use the old one, it's just going to ruin the new booster, and well, that's not going to be covered under warranty. Now there is some important parts to remember when changing a booster. You actually have to put this clevis in the right position. So because this is an adjustable part, you do have to measure how far the nut is in relation to, well, the booster, right? So what I end up doing is just loosening this clevis and removing the nut and removing the clevis itself. Now this is what the clevis looks like, of course. And what I'd also do is count the threads so I know what position that clevis was in. Now an easy way to do this is just putting the boosters head to head and then kind of just adjusting the nut so that you're at the right length. And I'll give you another angle of what that actually looks like so that you're able to make the appropriate adjustment. And as you guys can see here, that is the appropriate length, just by kind of putting the 2 boosters together and then kind of seeing where that nut actually lies. Then just go ahead and reinstall the clevis and tighten the nut and reinstall the new booster into the vehicle. So after reinstalling the booster, we're going to go ahead and go back to the inside of the vehicle and make sure we reassemble the vehicle. Now you got to make sure that all the parts that you took off are reinstalled. You cannot forget any of these parts. These are very, very important parts. You are dealing with a brake system after all, and you got to make sure that this pin is inserted. Now I have seen people forget a clip for that pin, for that clevis, and well, I have seen where that pin has slidden out and you lose brake function. So it's very important that you put that clip in and that pin in as well. Now before we go ahead and install our master cylinder, we have to do a process what is called bench bleeding. Now what bench bleeding is basically you're taking and removing all the air out of the master cylinder by putting brake fluid inside and cycling the master cylinder until all the air basically comes out. Now I have a kind of a very crude method of doing it, and it is quite messy, I will say, but this is the only way I was able to do it because, well, I don't have the kind of the homemade tools to be able to do this. Now they do make kits for that, but honestly I just didn't have time to go get a kit and just for this small process. So anyways, once I was completed with the bench bleeding process and got all the air out of the master cylinder, it's time to put the master cylinder back onto its normal position. And I don't fasten the nuts to the master cylinder just yet. I actually want to get the brake lines on there first. This is actually a kind of a tip for you guys. If you guys are struggling to get the brake lines on, you want to make sure that the master cylinder is loose, just so that you have a little bit of wiggle room to be able to thread those brake lines nice and easy. As you guys can see, I'm just doing it by hand and they're threading in no problem. Now also I'm going to go ahead and reinstall the vacuum hoses and then go ahead and snug all our brake lines as well, just to make sure we don't have any leaks there and make sure that they're nice and snug as well. So once I got all the brake lines nice and tight, I go ahead and install the fastening nuts for the master cylinder, of course, any electrical sensors, and of course the vacuum hose clamp. And then just go ahead and make sure everything is nice and snugged up, double check all your work. And well, now we're on to just basically reassembly of the intake system and all the parts that we basically removed. Now at this point, I actually have an assistant, my neighbor Jerry. So he's actually going to help me bleed the brakes, because anytime you do a master cylinder, just because you bench bleed it does not necessarily mean that there's no air in the system. Of course, because we had those lines open, that basically lets air inside the system. So of course we still have to bleed the brakes and try to get as much air out of that system as possible. Now, anytime you are doing a master cylinder, if you don't bench bleed, you could be there for days trying to bleed out the brakes, because you will notice that you'll have a spongy feeling brake pedal, and that's basically because you probably didn't bench bleed and you have massive amounts of air in the master cylinder. Now, of course, trying to reinstall this hose, I'll go ahead and heat it up with a torch. That way it's nice and soft so it doesn't split the hose, and I'm able to install it without the hose actually splitting. So now that that is all taken care of, let's go ahead and bleed these brakes. Now, of course, I'm going to have my lovely assistant, Jerry, go ahead and pump the brakes for me. And we're going to start with the passenger rear. Now, the main goal is to remove all the air in this vehicle. And there is actually a specific sequence that you need to do in order to get as much air out of that system as possible. And basically what we're looking for is a nice steady stream with no air bubbles in that brake fluid. So basically what I do here is basically I allow Jerry to pump the brakes, have him press on the brake and hold, and then go ahead and open the bleeder, and that forces the fluid to come out and any remaining air that is left over in the system. And then finally, after the brake bleeding sequence, we go ahead and put it back together, come back from a test drive, and well, that is basically that. Well guys, after a quick test drive, the car is running great. Now we have some solid brakes, and she's gonna be real happy when she gets this car back. Now, of course, we went ahead and replaced the booster, the master cylinder, the intake boot, and of course the front rotors and front pads. Now this car does need a lot more work, unfortunately, but like I said, due to a budget restriction, well, you know, this is what we can do for her right now to get at least a roadworthy, safe car for her that has some solid brakes and is running much better. No more check engine light, no more random misfires, and well, I think she should be pretty satisfied. Anyway guys, hopefully you guys enjoyed that video, and stay wrenching, stay spraying. Catch you guys on the next one.